Hello and welcome to this episode of the Kings of Garbage Time Football Podcast, where we help you sort through the garbage that is mainstream football analysis to become a more knowledgeable football fan and a better fantasy football general manager. I am here with Colton Watson, Omar Rodriguez, Joseph Beltran, and making his podcast debut, the seventh, I believe, member of our team now, Simon McGulpin. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here finally. After watching all these episodes, finally get to join in and tell you guys how wrong you guys are.
There we go. And Simon is here. We wanted to make sure Simon was here before we got to this topic because he is basically the inspiration for this topic from Colton, which is team building. So, Colton, I want you to go ahead and explain why we went ahead with this topic and why you wanted to talk specifically with Simon about this topic.
Okay, so the misconception, I think, of fantasy is that you need to do something a certain way to win. And that's not really true because when you look at it, there are a lot of ways you can win. Generally, I personally believe that you should build your team around core players and then trade away the ones that you don't see as a core for future value. Because I look at it as there's 12 men, usually 12 guys in a standard league, and only one of you guys can win. So the guy who's going to win at the end, to me, should have the most team value, right? So the better players overall, the better depth, all this stuff. And the only way I see that you could get that is through trades. But Simon, on the other hand, and some of these other guys in here are on the other end of that spectrum to where they have their core team and they don't necessarily want to take risk with trading. So they'll keep their core team and build through draft, or maybe they'll do a very, very safe trade, but they don't want to put a lot of risk into their trades to mess up their team, which I respect too. And that's why Simon is here.
Yep. Yeah, basically, I'm the opposite. We just looked at the numbers earlier, but I've done 3 trades in the past year. Basically, one of them was inconsequential. I was just holding a player for someone. And then 2 were more calculated because I needed to fill a position because I literally had no one. At one point, I had Jameis Winston as my starter, and that was when he was going to New Orleans and going to be a backup. And so I needed to pick someone up. And so I did my first trade of the whole league when we joined Sleeper, which was just 2 third-round draft picks for Ryan Tannehill, betting that he would have the same success he did at the end of the year, which he did. Eventually, he won me the league in the semifinal game before the league championship. And so that was definitely a good bet. And then the most recent trade I did was my first round draft pick and then swapping second round draft picks with Omar for Russell Wilson. The way I figured that one is just at my position I was at pick 12 in the first round. There wasn't anyone I liked at that spot, and I didn't feel like I could get equal value to anyone. So I might as well get a higher pick in the second, pick someone up that I think has potential to develop. In this case, I got the Jets quarterback that they just drafted. We'll see what happens with that. That's more of a risky pick in my opinion, but if he turns out well, I could use him as trade bait essentially in the future, which is a theme I usually follow with my team on that. And so basically going to use him as trade bait and then trade him away to Juan, who you guys saw in the last episode, who's a Jets fan probably. That's what's probably going to happen. But I basically draft my teams and I don't touch them at all. I don't trade away anyone risky at all.
Yeah, so I think Simon might have froze here. Simon, can you hear me?
Okay, we move on without him.
Well, Simon froze here. So speaking of him drafting his team and then not really touching it at all. Oh, there you are, Simon.
Good.
All right.
Oh, sorry about that.
So I wanna go through Simon's team here real quick. The players that he's drafted so far. In our dynasty startup was 2018. He drafted Ezekiel Elliott. He's still on the roster. He drafted Ronald Jones. He's still on the roster. Devin Singletary. Did you pick him in a rookie draft?
Yeah, he was a rookie draft.
So Devin Singletary was in the rookie draft in 2019, I believe. He still has him on the roster. Both of the Chargers' backup running backs, he still has. And then in the startup again, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Calvin Ridley, Robbie Anderson, all were players, and Travis Kelce, all were players that Simon drafted in our startup in 2018 and still has. And he added in a rookie draft in 2020, Justin Jefferson, who he also still has.
So I've
So
had some decent luck, at least with wide receivers. But
so Simon very much does not touch his roster all that much
At all.
that he
Mhm.
drafted.
Mhm.
Someone that does is he knows exactly what I'm talking about is Joseph. Joseph has, since we joined Sleeper in May of 2020, it's been about 15 months, has made 51 trades in our league. Just about every player in the league has been on Joseph's roster at some point. It feels like Joseph, you did make the playoffs last year. I believe you made it 2 years in a row now. After a not great start in our league history. So what is your mindset when it comes to trading away players? Because obviously you do it a lot. So like, what is the thinking that goes behind why you make so many moves?
I get frustrated with players pretty easily. And I think Russell Wilson would be one of the best examples of this. I think it was 2018 or 2019. He was playing the Bears in like week 1, and I needed like 10 points or something. And he got like 8 or 9 or something. And I just traded him like a couple weeks later. Just like the only players I don't trade are Cowboys, which are kind of my core, and they're the only people who won't get moved, like Lamb and Cooper and Dak. But my logic with everyone else is available. Because if you think you can upgrade or get a better player, I do it. Even if it looks like you're losing the trade, like I'll do it just to take the shot. Because I've done the 51, and my guess is I've probably ended up good on like half or more. So it's half or more. I think it set me up because I like my team concept now. And of course, the core is people I don't trade, but it's just like you trade for what you think will work out. Even if you're losing, I'll just do it just to see if it works out because there's a risk, but you just got to understand that if the reward is greater than the risk, you should do it.
Yeah, so Colton, me, you, and Omar all are around roughly the same amount of trades. We're in between. I believe I have 27, and Omar's around 20, something around there, and you're somewhere in between. We don't make as many trades, but is there like a philosophy that guides the way you trade? Especially after last season where you missed the playoffs and you started going back through your roster and trying to figure things out.
I think for fantasy, I feel like I'm kind of a perfectionist. I want to really get value. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I like to see fantasy and your team, especially mostly this applies to Dynasty for the most part. But when I look at my team, I see like they're stocks, right? And I want to grow my portfolio. And the end game is to have a huge portfolio of value. And with that portfolio value, you can go out and trade for other commodities, which are basically players, and they strengthen your overall portfolio because you might need a wide receiver, but you have a lot of RB depth, and RBs in certain leagues, especially in non-super flex, are worth a lot more than receivers. So you do this trade, you get this receiver, you get like a first back. You hopefully can flip that first into an RB itself, replace the RB value. You have wide receiver value. That's value gained, right? So really how I look at it is just consistently getting value. And that's the way I see to win a league. But I also do want to mention how Joseph mentioned earlier. I feel like I try to avoid this, but he was mentioning how like certain players can tick you off. And I think you could see that with someone like Tyler Lockett. And also, personally, for me, I used to really like Brandon Cooks on the Saints. And then he would just have weeks, I think his last year there, where he was just like terrible some weeks and good some weeks. And he was still a wide receiver 1. But for me, just on how consistent he was, I wasn't getting the wide receiver 1 value. And I think that was a criticism of Tyreek Hill before he kind of cemented his position last year, was that, look, these guys are pretty boom or bust, but that's just one thing to avoid. I would just kind of avoid selling those guys because at the end of the season, they still are productive. So you don't want to undersell them, but I understand keeping them or not keeping them. It just depends on the value. So never sell players who are undervalued and always chase the value is how I like view, I guess, dynasty or team building.
Yeah. So Omar, I want to get to you real quick on non-trade related stuff. But before we move on from trades, I also wanted to hit a recent shift that I've had in our league where Colton will remember he tried to sell me, I believe it was Deshaun Watson for a first-round pick a while back. Is that right?
I believe I have. Yeah, I believe I did send that.
And I told Colton, I really want to hold on to my first-round pick. I like making picks in the first round of rookie drafts. I feel like that's where you get really good value. And then since then, my philosophy has changed entirely, where I will now shell out picks and backup players to bring in stars. So most recently, we had the 4-team trade that Omar, Joseph, Colton, and I were all a part of, where a lot of moving pieces, but I ended up getting Alvin Kamara after giving up Marquise Brown, Miles Sanders, Josh Palmer, 2 first-round picks, and a second-round pick that we believe is going to be a very high second-round pick. And then going back even further, Joseph, my trade with you and Brandon before the Deshaun Watson stuff sort of went off the rails, but I brought in Deshaun and Stephon Diggs along with 2/3 for Mike Williams, Nyheim Hines, 2 first and 4 second-round picks. So my entire philosophy has changed now to where I am chasing after star players. I am getting rid of draft picks. I will take my chances on scooping good rookies in the 3rd or even 4th round of our rookie drafts. But that has sort of been the big shift I've had since we've joined this league. Last year was the second time in 5 years that I've missed the playoffs, and I don't plan on that happening again. So I've loaded up. But yeah, I think those kind of shifts are something that happens in the natural evolution of being a fantasy football general manager.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. They say that the best position to be in is either first or last, because last you're getting the first pick, and first obviously you're winning everything. So really having that awareness of where your team is at is very important. You need to know if you're rebuilding or if you're actually trying to win. And with this, the league we're mentioning right now, 1 QB, I'm actually trying to win, but in the super flex, I'm rebuilding. So there's just a different shift in philosophy there, right? If you're a rebuilding team, you don't want to give up too many assets, even for a proven vet, because that vet being on your team means nothing when you're not winning games because the rest of your team sucks, right? So mainly it's about having that awareness to know when to commit to a rebuild and when to commit to, obviously trying to win it all.
Omar, speaking of, I believe that was part of the thinking about why you finally moved on from the last original startup player you had, Alvin Kamara. You became a rebuilding team before that. You ended up with 3 picks in the top half of the first round of our rookie draft, where you took Javonte Williams, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Waddle. So what has been your thinking in your rebuild now since the end of last season?
Well, since the end of last season, I've definitely done a few trades. My whole strategy now in that league, as you guys know, I am one of the rebuilding teams, me and Juan. I figured maybe not this last season, but like towards the end of the season before, I was having issues getting into playoffs. My team was always just letting me down right before playoffs. And it's just because, I was lacking depth in just any certain category. And, through trades, I would sometimes be lacking wide receiver or running back. And, it just changed over time. And so I figured I'd sell whatever pieces I had and, try to go for a rebuild. And just recently selling Kamara was definitely like my last move in my full rebuild. Now I have a pretty strong core. Like Colton said, I kind of tried to make my core based on value, figuring, even if these guys are young, they still have a lot of value because they are starters, and they're only, most of my starters are all 2-3 years into the league. So I know they'll be on my roster for the next, 3-4 years. And along with that, I have 4 first-round picks for this next upcoming rookie draft. And I believe Juan has another 3. So it kind of makes it easier. So I know who I'll be looking to get next year. And that way I can fill the positions where I lack the depth. So I think that maybe not this upcoming year, or maybe even not the next year after that. If I go and maybe do something like Simon and kind of just stick with what I have and try not to touch it, I think that value can stay pretty close to what it's at and just only go up from there. So that's kind of what I'm looking to do in that league right now. And that's in our other Superflex league. I figured I wanted to do something like the opposite because I didn't want to be rebuilding in 2 dynasty leagues. That sounds like super boring. So I went with my position in the second round. I decided I was just going to be a win now team, and I selected Darren Waller because Darren Waller to the moon, baby. And so I think my whole strategy with this team was just kind of go for people who have high ceilings because their value is just always crazy, and build a core around them. Go for maybe like having 3 or 4 guys who can drop 30 points a week, having them lead my team. And I think losing Michael Thomas might be enough to put my team a little to the rails, but I think the last trade I made with Joseph for Tyler Boyd is going to be enough to fill that flex spot for now until Michael Thomas hopefully comes back soon. Because I think with having Tyler Boyd and Michael Thomas both on my team, once he's back and healthy, I'll definitely be a very competitive team. But I definitely I'm excited for football this year. I think that hopefully injuries aren't too crazy like last year, so it won't have to affect my strategy.
They've already
moving
pretty
forward.
much tanked me a little bit, so
Yeah, I know.
right on track from last year as the Akers and Michael Thomas owner. But I don't know where Zachary was going to take this next topic, but I actually had a question for Simon.
Yeah.
And you kind of covered a little bit, but like, is your philosophy just based around drafting good? Because it seems like your style is very risky in the sense that like you need to hit on draft picks to actually build like a good team. Because like, what would happen? You had a really good startup draft. Looking back, what happens if your startup draft was bad and then you also didn't draft guys like Justin Jefferson?
Well,
before you start on that, Simon, I wanna pull up your roster really quick, because to add something to this is your philosophy of no trading and being risky, as Colton said. Your running backs right now
are horrible
in that league is Ezekiel Elliott, Ronald Jones, Devin Singletary, and then basically nothing else.
Yeah.
And you have Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Calvin Ridley, Cole Beasley, Jamison Crowder, Robbie Anderson, Curtis Samuel, and Justin Jefferson. So that's eight starting receivers for most people's rosters for a guy that doesn't really trade and who's shallow on running backs. So what is the thinking there on top of Colton's question?
Part of that goes into my draft strategy. When I draft, I try to get at least one of each position first that I believe in. Or so luckily at that time it was Ezekiel Elliott. And so I'm like, okay, I'm fine on running back. But then I also look at the value where I don't take the positional value as seriously as I do what I believe in the player themselves. So if I rather take a player that I know is a number one on that team and is going to be a number one for a long period of time, than take a up and coming running back who is projected as a number one and who may be a number one, barring if you don't know, they could have an injury prone career and things like that. So that's partly why I went for players like Kelsey. Evans at the time was the number one by himself. And then when I get after I get at least one player in each position that I believe is a number one on their team and will be considered a number one in their position, or the potential number one that I think is consistent and has a very high floor, then I'll start going for higher potential players that I believe in could develop. But I don't take the philosophy of I need to get 2 running backs first, or I need to get these positions first. I try to take the highest value at that position. Like if I were drafting for like an actual team in the NFL, that's what I do. In the same with my rookie drafts. Even though I need running backs, I still drafted Justin Jefferson instead, because the value of having one of the top wide receiver prospects versus a running back who's probably not even going to play, because I think Keyshawn Vaughn was the last off the board at that point. And
you probably got like AJ Dillon or someone, but
still, I rather
Gibson,
Justin Jefferson's value over those guys. I feel like is way more.
Of course, his value is the best from that draft out of non-super flex, right? I would be pretty confident Justin Jefferson and 1 QB is like the most valuable there.
That's why I try to go for whoever's the most valuable at the time, even though I don't have a lot of picks because I don't trade. And that's why I would have rather went for a wide receiver that time, despite what my roster is. And then my philosophy is eventually, hopefully with those potential guys, I'll get a good running back and I could just get rid of the shit or crap. Sorry, I don't know if we're censoring, but I can get rid of that. And eventually over time. So as long as I have all these star players in these other positions, I'm not as worried about that one hole in like the RB2, especially when it comes to like bye weeks, because I could literally fill in any wide receiver in a bye week and not have to even worry about it at all. I'm not worried about the bye week where my whole team falls apart and I lose that week, where other people are like, oh, I have a guaranteed loss this week because all my starters are out and things like that. Or I have 2 starters out this week, 2 out that week, and they're worried about that. Whereas I rather have high floor players with low injury risk than high potential like prospects that are projected high. And so I really don't draft anyone like that high in the first like 4 or 5 rounds unless I actually like believe in them as a player. I believe that they're not injury prone and they have a high floor and they're going to be the number 1 on their individual team. So that's why I do less running back picks, because first off, all of them go away. And then when you start getting into those number 2 running backs, most of them are very like hit or miss oftentimes with injuries or just what their actual situation is.
Well, just to kind of add on to that, like if you're in a PPR league, what I've seen and what I've learned from looking at your team is that you don't need strong RB depth to win, right? So you just need to be good in some position that's like excellent above others. And for you, it's receivers. And you can have guys like Singletary, who obviously no one really wants to own right now, but he still might get, 8 to 10 points a week, which could be enough to win you that week when you're blowing them out in another category. So just something I learned from your team. And obviously PPR makes it even better for the guys that aren't getting like 20 touches a game. Those 5 catches for 30 yards really actually do help when you need them to.
Exactly. And another thing with the only having one good running back, pick up as many handcuffs as you can. Basically, if one person goes down, then you got a starter for that week. So I just try to pick up as many like backups to starters I can if I can't have an actual starter. This way, especially if I know that it's like a possible injury prone situation. So that's why I have Chargers running backs, even though Austin Eckler's there, but he got injured at one point. So I could throw one of them in. They both did bad, but it's just the chance that you have with that. A good example of that is Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray has always like been a really great like handcuff to have, because whenever they actually give him the ball, he always does good and produces like whatever team he's been on, which is kind of surprising. I don't know why he's not a number 1 back on other teams, considering how well he does when he actually gets the ball. But that's one example. So if you don't have the position, get as many handcuffs. I wouldn't say go for as many like potential players that you think could develop necessarily. If you want to win now, go for handcuffs. And then the odds or chances, if you're lucky, you'll have at least one of those handcuffs get a starting spot based off injury, which really could help supplement your team if you have excellent like depth at all the other positions.
Well, just to add on to that, you drafted in the other league, in the Superflex tight end premium we did, you drafted Henderson. Yeah. And now that Akers obviously not really injury prone situation, just pretty freaking unfortunate actually. But now you have a RB who's looking at a workhorse season in that offense for literally, you got him pretty much for free, and you're a win now team in that league. So obviously you're going to need the help, and you got it through the handcuff system that you're just talking about. So you definitely do put what you say into practice.
Yeah. And same thing with that other league. It's like I only had Alvin Kamara as my first round. Usually if I'm my first round, I'll get like the highest running back I can, dependent, because that's like the best opportunity you have to get a good back that's dependable that you can bet on. Outside of that, it's a little hit or miss. But so I had Alvin Kamara, and then I have a bunch of other guys who I think could, depend, barring injury, take that. So I have like Leonard Fournette. So if Ronald Jones gets injured, then he's the top guy, or if he wins the job, he's the top guy, stuff like that. And so you got to look at like who do you think can actually win a job or can take a job over if there's injury and actually be successful. If you're not going to go full running backs in the beginning, because I know people like to focus on running backs, but if you're not in like a basic standard league, I don't feel like running backs are as important as everyone makes them out to be.
All right. So I feel my heart splitting in two here as the running back stacker that I am. So as we come up on 8 minutes to go, before we get to that, I want to get to Omar and Joseph here. How much stock do you guys put in on running backs? Is there any position that you prioritize more so? I know one other, aside from running backs, that I tend to focus on is tight ends, just because they're so scarce. If you can have a really good backup to a really good starter, you're pretty much set for a while. Is there any position, Omar, that you would put more weight on in our normal home league or in our super flex league?
Yeah, well, I think that especially in our super flex league, I would agree with you in the tight end scarcity. It's definitely a position where I wanted to stack up on and not have to worry about it, at least for a little while, because I know that we're not going to have any prospects like Kyle Pitts come up anytime soon,
And real
So
quick,
I think
our super flex league is a tight end premium league, so it's 2 points per reception. So
They're like right under QBs, or sometimes tied with QBs, depending
Right.
on the guy.
so keep going.
Mhm,
Omar.
mhm. Yeah, and then also definitely quarterback. That's why my first pick was a Dak Prescott, because I needed somebody young. I needed somebody who's going to throw thousands of yards. I think he's going to go do crazy numbers this year. And I think one thing that I wanted to do a little differently, I'm testing it out. I kind of don't want to say it out loud, I guess, but I'm going to do it anyways because I already did my most important drafts. Um, but I definitely am trying to do a different strategy. I've noticed that we have a lot of wide receivers that this year round where the depth is just, I think, pretty crazy deep. You can find some pretty good steals usually now in the late rounds. And so in the first few rounds of these drafts, I'm looking now to usually try to sneak out with two good bell cow running backs, and then leaving with a high ceiling quarterback or tight end, just depending which one's there value. In this case, I walked out with Dak Prescott and Darren Waller in our tight end premium league, and I think that's just like a crazy good combo. Immediately, like 4 or 5 rounds into the draft, I knew my team was a win now team, and that's what I was going to have to base the rest of my picks off of. And so I think that that's some of my strategy going into like other leagues that I'm doing with other like friends and coworkers. I'm just going for trying to base my strategy off of getting at least 2 solid running backs who I know I'm just going to be able to start every week and I can just depend on. And then, sneak out with getting another 2 wide receivers, maybe in the next following round, who also, I value that they're still going to do good. They're going to be probably wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 of a team. And, maybe they're not going to be dropping as much as some of these wide receivers who are putting up like 1,500 yards in the year, but they're still going to be putting up good numbers, maybe 5-10 points on average less a week, which I think I can live with if I have somebody who's like top 3 at their position at quarterback or tight end on my team instead. So I think that's kind of what I'm doing this year.
And what about you, Joseph? Any positions, as we come up with 4 minutes left here, that you prioritize?
When it comes to one QB, I don't, other than Simon, I guess, you can't win without 2 running backs. Those 2 need to be your core. And when it comes to tight end, if you don't get those top 5 or 6 guys, it's just not worth it. So QBs there's a pretty good like depth there too, and wide receiver. So I just think you got to get those 2 RBs, and from there you can decide, do you want that tight end in the 3rd round, or do you just want to go wide receivers? Because you can't wait on tight end, because if you wait, there's no point in picking one until the end. So I just think that you got to get those 2 RBs, and then from there on you can decide.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get back to the running backs, because obviously what Simon said, that you do not need a deep running back stable to win, is true, and he proved it last year. But I also think having a deep running back stable is something that can help you win. And I think my team made a pretty good case for that last year. I rolled into last season. I had decent wide receivers. I brought in Keenan Allen before the start of the season and had DJ Moore. I also had Julio Jones, who didn't play that much. And then after that, my receivers were nothing special. I had to get starts out of Hunter Renfrow and Mike Williams going forward. I did have Darren Waller. That was a big help. Thank you, Joseph. And then my starting quarterbacks were Cam Newton and Derek Carr throughout the season. But I came in with really good running backs, and then I immediately lost pretty much all of them. Christian McCaffrey went down in week 3. Raheem Mostert went down in week 2. Tariq Cohen went down in week 3 or 4. And I ended up going out. I got Myles Gaskin for a 3rd-round pick once he began to break out. I got Mike Davis from Colton for another 3rd-round pick, which ended up being a big help to me the rest of the season. I still had Nyheim Hines. I had pretty good RB depth last year, and it ultimately kept my season afloat. Now, granted, I missed the playoffs, but that was more because I had the toughest schedule, arguably, in league history. I was one of the top scoring teams in the history of our league last year and ended up going 6-7 and missing the playoffs. I don't think that is as much indictment of my team as it is my luck. I think Colton can relate to that. But I've always based my teams around having a deep running back stable. I like to have at least 5, but preferably 6 running backs that I can start in a given week, because I throw those running backs in at flex. I try not to flex too many receivers. And then I go down and I try to grab late value receivers to fill out my roster. So our Dynasty Superflex tight end premium league, I think, is a good example of me reverting to my roots, because I spent the first pick on a quarterback, obviously. I doubled up on tight ends. My running backs were not that impressive. Trey Sermon and Myles Gaskin, I think, would have been my starting 2. No, Miles Sanders I did get along with Trey Sermon and Myles Gaskin. And then after the draft was over, I went out and I gave away my draft picks again to Chase Stars, and I got Chris Carson and Joe Mixon coming back in. And now I have a deep running back stable again. So, Colton, your thoughts on when running back stables are appropriate versus when you can afford to sort of shell out and just leave the position as it is?
Yeah, thanks for the assist there. Basically, what I wanted to say about this was that I believe running backs are valuable for the most part, but you devalue them based on your team. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier in the podcast, was that there are times where you don't really, well, you need to read your team and know if you're rebuild or are competing. And in my situation in the Superflex, I am in a rebuild. So at one point, I believe I drafted Antonio Gibson Swift, and then I had done this trade where I got Justin Herbert, traded him for a lot, and then I ended up with like CEH and some other firsts and pieces. And I traded CEH away immediately for a first and Chris Godwin, who I think has huge upside still. And the reason I did that is because if you're in a position where the rest of your team is just bad, those RBs competing and doing good really is just like empty points every week. And they depreciate at the fastest rate for any position. So by the time an RB is like 26, people are already not willing to pay what their actual value might be worth. And then you hit like 28, 29, they might be backups or out of the league. So it really just depends on when to time you getting the RBs. And for Zachary's situation, he's obviously compete now. For me, it was rebuild. So I also sold Gibson, who I like, but I don't know about years from now when I'm ready to compete if he'll still be the same guy with how he's built and, you know, how he takes workloads. And he's already dealing with like turf toe and other issues. I don't know if that'll persist, but I don't regret moving him. And it's really just to get value, which goes back to my whole point earlier about just acquiring value for your team. So you're having more value on your team to give you a higher chance to win and get your edges that way, and do trades at positions where you might need stuff. So maybe I don't hit on my first and I have to go back later and trade for one of these running backs. I have the capital to do so. So it's really a give and take. And a lot of it is just based on how your team is and having that situational awareness to know where your team is. So Zachary definitely knows where his team is, and I know where my team is, and our situations are reversed, but should work out in a successful way for both of us.
Now, granted, I am most able to do this because of the other big thing I try to do in leagues, which is acquire a star tight end. I mentioned Joseph. He was the one that traded me Darren Waller, which was what honestly set me up to have a great contending team. I've since invested rookie picks in Adam Troutman in 2020 and this past year in Kylan Granson on the Indianapolis Colts, who I think has a pretty high ceiling. Joseph Has your view on tight ends shifted since that trade at all? Like,
Yeah, I didn't realize how bad it was because I had Waller, and when he had like 10 weeks, I was like mad. But now I have tight ends who will drop like 2 or 3 or 5 points, and I'm just like, it's like such a like downgrade compared to anyone who has like a Kittle or a Kelsey or a Pitts or all of them. It's just like, and they're so hard to get. Like no one wants to pay for what they're actual worth, but everyone knows what they're worth because you see the results when you play against someone with them. And just because they have them, they're gonna have like a 10-point up on you. And that determines the results so many times. But if you want to trade for one, you're probably giving up like a running back and some extra stuff. And most people just won't do that because they don't think it's worth it. But in all reality, you only can start one tight end. And there's only like 6 good ones. So you're just stuck in that bubble where it's like you can either just sacrifice and take that L on that trade and just overpay, or you can just sit there and just get mad whenever you get like 3 or 4 points every week.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's what's good about sorry to cut you off, but I was just going to mention that's what's good about the 2-point tight end premium. Obviously, the top guys are even going to be even more top with how they compete against. I think Travis Kelce, I looked through, he'd be like the QB7 on points last year, which is insane. And that's what 6-point passing TDs. So, yeah, very insane. But obviously, 2-point tight end premium also helps for the smaller guys to help so that they can compete against these receivers and running backs, because you're looking at a guy like Jonnu Smith, who really isn't much to look at, but then you factor in 2-point tight end premium. He's competing with, RB2s and wide receiver 2s. So it really helps even the field at least a little bit. So that's something I wanted to throw in as a way to kind of counteract the whole tight end wasteland situation.
Yeah. I just wanted to agree with that too. Even though I talk about like RB2, I feel like is like the hole I always put in like all my teams basically. But I always like get a top tight end in all my leagues that I play in, no matter what. Like in our super dynasty flex, after I got Kamara in first round, I made sure to get Kelsey right away. In that, and then I have Kelsey in my other league, and then even going back into the past when Greg Olsen was good, I had Greg Olsen. One of his last years when he was still really good. And I always try to make sure to get that one top tight end that you could start on every week, because you could always suffer for 1 week with a tight end that gives you 5 points. As long as you get those other 10 weeks where they're above and beyond, because those top tight ends are so many more points, it just makes such a big difference. Whereas that's part of the reason why I can have a hole in my running back to where I just get a guy who's like a third down back, is because I have Travis Kelce. And so it gives me that boost there. So if you're in the position, at least the right position in the draft, I wouldn't say overdraft the tight end one, but if you're in the right position, maybe in a snake draft to hit a top player and then get a tight end one, then I think it's worth getting that tight end over a top receiver just to have that premium on the position.
yeah, Omar, I want to get you in here because you kind of hit big in our home league on the tight end position. You ended up with Robert Tonyan, who obviously had a big year and has now sort of established himself as one of not the top sort of 3, the pinnacle guys, but a pretty reliable tight end, especially with Aaron Rodgers. So what went into the decision to bring in Robert Tonyan, and what goes into that decision to sort of try and scoop tight ends up before they end up increasing their value, like we've talked about with Darren Waller and other guys?
So this is actually a little bit of intel, you guys. I'm only going to give you a snippet of, but somebody who I actually follow and get a lot of my information from. He's actually a Green Bay Packers fan, and he was like, "Hey, like you didn't hear this from me, but Robert Tonyan is going to drop a lot of points this year, and he will be the tight end." Number 1 for the Packers. And just as with the conversation we were having yesterday at your house yesterday, me and Juan, is that, I knew that, Sternberger wasn't going to be the starter there. And sometimes, in those positions, you have to try to find somebody who's going to hit because, like we said, it's so scarce that, when you hit on this position, you can get value like midway through the season last year, I picked up Mo Alley Cox, and I was able to flip him like within like 2 weeks to your brother Blaine for Russell Gage, who now his values increased for sure. And all because he had like 3 weeks where he was putting up crazy numbers. I believe it was like over like 70 yards every week, putting up like a touchdown every week as well. And it's those guys who you want to look after in the waiver wire, because you can trade them to somebody who's a little weak at that position. Like you said earlier with Colton sending you Mike Davis and Miles Gaskin for third round picks. Sometimes that's even if you don't need the pick. Like I believe Colton really didn't need Mike Davis. He also, I believe, traded somebody else that week. I think to me, maybe like McKissick or
Traded you
Gio
a few
Bernard or
players.
something.
I think I traded you
Yeah.
Gio Bernard and McKissick both for like fourths, just because I was trying to for that particular year I was trying to rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, even if you don't need them, you pick them up because you can make something off of it. And in this case, the tight end, I always try to go after somebody because, in my last years in our league, I'm usually somewhere, towards the back end of the pack, but not at the end. So I don't really get to hit on a lot of these running backs or wide receivers and the waiver wires. And I'd like to go for value instead. So that's I guess, what went into that.
Yeah. So tight ends, I think our league has started to appreciate them a lot more. I know that's always been a goal of mine, is to get a tight end in the first 3 rounds. When we did that startup for the Superflex Tight End Premium League, I ended up stacking Mark Andrews with Lamar Jackson in the 2nd round. And then when it came around to my pick, I saw TJ Hawkinson was there. And I figured, why not? Why not flex a tight end the entire year? So I think that's a position that our league has learned to appreciate, especially after last year, where it was a pretty rough year for tight ends outside of the normal names. Colton, is there anything else team building wise that you want to throw out here that I might have overlooked so far?
I just want to, I guess, kind of wrap it up in the sense that you really don't need one single strategy to actually win, but you need to stick to whatever you pick. From startup to basically, from the beginning to startup, you need to know, okay, I'm going to retool a little bit. I'm going to pick some younger players who might not help me win now, but in the future I'll be stacked. So you're kind of like a rebuild from start, which ain't a bad thing if you're committed to it. The thing that gets a bad rap for rebuild is people they're impatient. They don't like waiting for the return. So for me, for example, just to use a personal situation I have in the Superflex, I have like 10 first or 11 first over the next 3 drafts or 4 drafts, something crazy like that. And I'm patiently waiting. I know my team's not going to be good, but I have some core players and I'm just waiting for the return. So if you're rebuilding, wait for a return. If you want to go for it from the jump, like how Simon and Zachary tend to do, draft your team well to rebuild. Don't really care about age too much. If you're just trying to win, you can always fix it later after you win. And just stick to that. Stick to know what you're trying to do. Do not cross strategies, because that's when you get in a position where you're just stuck. Not good at one thing, not good at another. So you really just want to commit to a single strategy would be my main advice. Rebuild or competing.
Joseph, anything you want to add?
It's just know where you are. If you're in the middle, you just don't want to be there because you're just stuck there. It's hard to build a team if you're picking in the middle every year. You're not going to get that star RB or that star wide receiver. So you got to commit, either go for it or not.
Omar, parting words of wisdom for the people.
I think I pretty much said what I need to, except for, one thing I maybe did want to mention from my own personal experience in this recent startup we did is that you want to make sure you don't leave yourself too weak, maybe in one certain area. Somewhere along my draft, I should have gone after a 3rd quarterback, maybe a little sooner, and taken that hit on like a backup wide receiver or running back. Because, luckily I did just so happen that Carson Wentz got injured and I had Jacob Eason sitting there. But, even then we don't really know if he's going to even get any play time. So I'm still hoping I can pick one up on the waiver wire or get one off somebody if they're looking to move a quarterback. So yeah, just make sure you're not too weak on, I guess, on a position.
Simon, the defending Dynasty League champion,
Yeah.
after 2 years of Colton's victories and then a year of my own in our final
Mhm.
redraft year. Simon,
Yeah.
you are the defending champion. You get the last word on the
Yeah.
topic of team building.
I wouldn't necessarily take any of my team building strategies as gospel because if you look up anything else, mostly it's always get 2 running backs or do other stuff like that. And so I'm not the most, I would say I'm not the typical when it comes to team building strategies, especially since I don't trade. But one thing I would say is definitely know your strategy, like they said, stick to it. And then another tip I wanted to say is if you are doing a dynasty or startup, make sure you know your rookies. Act like you do it as an actual GM would do and analyze them, watch the tape on them. Don't just go off like mock boards of who you think's a top. Find the ones that you think will develop and have the most potential, even if they're going to be buried under your picks for a few years. Just have them and stash them just for that. It's like a taxi sort of, because basically that's why I got Chris Godwin when he was a rookie. And then that's even why I drafted Justin Jefferson yesterday, because he was one of my favorite wide receiver prospects of them all. And I believed in his potential. And then also he has a number 2 role. He doesn't need to be in the number 1 right away. So look at like what you think your rookie can do in the future in a dynasty. And don't be afraid to hold on to them. Because there's some players that could be bust. Ronald Jones was a bust his first year. Like anyone would say that. But then even though I held him for a few years, he's now a decent serviceable like RB3, if you look at it. And so just don't be afraid to hold on to your rookies a little bit longer because they do have some value as long as you believe in them, unless they're like a total bust and you see like nothing, no potential, then cut them, get rid of the bait, but just hold them a little bit longer than you have to sometimes, I'd say.
Yeah. And so in closing, I also want to put this out here as a challenge to our league mates, many of whom I know watch this podcast. All 5 of us just put our genius out there for you to behold. So this is a challenge for you to try and take us down this year in either of our leagues. So I just wanted to throw that out there at the end. Gentlemen, thanks for hopping on the podcast. Everyone, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and follow the podcast on Twitter at Kings of GT. We'll put the little graphic up here on the screen somewhere. So, yeah, another week in the books. Another step closer to the NFL season. The Hall of Fame game, the preseason, the Cowboys, starts in just a few days. So we are getting closer. We are getting there. And none of us can wait for it. So, gentlemen, great podcast, and we'll see you next week.
See you.